got the closing yet. Okay. Quite. Is Emma about?
She's actually printing.
Oh, she's
Exactly
doing
what she's doing with.
I was going to say she could make that.
That's a good idea, isn't it?
Get Emma to forward to the
Can
copy.
you forward that version to Emma and get Emma to forward it directly to the inspector?
Can I say that the Inspector of Support have stopped for lunch?
We've not received an answer since I did.
That's because I
Just got it.
Not yet, and sure it's on the way. Yeah, just got it, thank you.
You're the only one without an answer, so apologies.
Yeah.
Is Emma doing that?
I've just emailed it to send to the inspector, unless you'd like to type your email in and I can send it directly to you now.
Can I come from? Can I come from
Yeah, that's
Emma?
fine.
Yeah.
She's on her way.
Next thing over cautious.
I don't think it is at all, sir.
What I'm told.
No, I think it's highly appropriate.
Maybe step
Yeah.
Ah. Would you be content with a written copy on the understanding the other copies are on its way to you?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, where you were with my learned friend.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Not at all.
Your fault. Right, off we go.
So these are our closing submissions. You will have noted that on any party's case, the proposals before the Secretary of State are agreed to meet planning and spatial requirements of the site. Functionally, it's agreed that the site will affect the transformation of this part of Oxford Street, consistent with the needs of the CAS, the International Centre, and that the stated requirement for, quotes, urgent and compelling change set out in the City Council's Place Strategy and Delivery Plan will be met. These represent heritage and public benefits of such a strategic order that they would significantly outweigh any reasonable identified heritage harm associated with the proposals. As a result, the heritage policies of the framework would be met. This is a powerful conclusion. No party is asserting that there actually is another better way of achieving these or substantially similar benefits, either through a refurbishment or at all. The highest it is put is that there might be. And so we say the evidence establishes conclusively that there are no realistic prospects of a viable or deliverable refurbishment option, given the multiple and inescapable constraints associated with the existing buildings in this particular market. That evidence was unchallenged, unmet, and I'm going to say largely unread by the relevant objective witnesses. That means that the substantive issue for the decision maker in this case, for the Secretary of State, therefore, is whether such urgently needed benefits should be turned away on the basis that there might be a refurbishment option which might be suited to meeting some of the requirements of the site. A complaint that both the local authorities in this case deliberately failed properly to consider the justification for the redevelopment of the site is both inaccurate and now irrelevant given the present state of evidence before the inquiry. It's notable, I say, that in closing, the learned friend dealt in closing the substantive issue, the practical real-world potential for reasonable refurbishment was almost entirely sidelined by the learned friend in favour of SAVE's assessment that there was not a specific consideration of Mr. Sturge's deep retrofit prior to application. So we will say and do say that there is on examination no reason to set aside the very clear and unambiguous findings of the authorities in this case to the effect that a redevelopment option is strongly supported by the provisions of the development plan. That being so, there should be a finding that the proposal accords with the provisions of an up-to-date development plan when read as a whole, and as a result, the planning permission should therefore be granted without further delay. You'll remember that in opening, I said that the case for the proposal would be based on 4 broad propositions, each one of which has been accepted by the relevant planning authorities. That opening is annexed to this closing, notionally, if not actually, on your
That was just arrived.
No, it's not the copy of the post.
And is hereby incorporated by reference of the closing. You've got both documents, so I'm happy to do that. I then set out what the 4 propositions were. I won't read those out. I now return to those propositions in closing with the benefit of the evidence having been heard. First, the existing site and its 3 separate buildings make a wholly inadequate contribution to the spatial operation of a sustainable capital. They aren't suited to meeting the land use requirements of the site. So this proposition can be taken shortly in closing because it's agreed between all 3 main parties now. In short, the existing buildings are woefully and inappropriately underused. At this location, that's inexcusable. For the policy reasons set out below, this is a site which should be making the most of its location. As a result, there is now, I'm pleased to say, common ground at the inquiry that there is a no do-nothing option. The planning system, it's agreed, needs to intervene on this site. And this is recognised by the fact that it's no part of SAVE's case that a light refurbishment or a facade retention would be appropriate. These options would, as it is agreed, fail to reflect the place of the site in the spatial makeup of the city. What is needed is something more. On that, everyone agrees. The question is what that might be. So with that extent of agreement now in place, I will look at the spatial inadequacies of the building, and they can be summarised more briefly than in opening. Retail failings. So you know that the existing store was in large part not designed to be a retail building. The building's composition and internal makeup reflect that history. It's a speculative 1930s office building of its time, reflecting the structural expediencies of 30s technology and an accretion of later make do and mend additions of no quality, which have been accumulated, adapted and converted in a piecemeal way over the century. You know that the 3 buildings now mainly house Marks and Spencer's Marble Arch, and in retail and in wider planning terms, the store element of the buildings at the site should now and could now be serving a thriving flagship function at this place of global importance in the retail hierarchy. But they're failing in that respect, and Marks and Spencer's explain why. And in truth, that evidence was not seriously challenged as to its essential truth. Their evidence, and that of Nash Bond, explains that the customer expectations of a store, especially at this location in the Global International Centre, where it would need to compete with other flagship stores of international quality, simply cannot be met in and about the existing buildings. That's due to their multiple and compounding constraints. Those constraints reflect its structure, composition and history. As such, the buildings are now not close to fit for purpose at this location. And again, there's an agreement as to that. There is an agreement that something needs to be done. The question is what? Uniquely, M&S has chosen to disclose its trading and footfall figures to the store for this inquiry. They confirm a trading pattern which is inconsistent with its function, inconsistent with the centre, and which in retail and commercial terms is simply unsustainable. These mean that the existing store and its modus operandi caused by the inescapable constraints of the building is failing. And that in turn is causing reputational harm to the brand. As a result, it is consistent with the position it takes on any failing store it has indicated that it will not continue trading from the existing store. It can't be criticised for that. Nobody criticises it for that decision. It owes a duty to its shareholders, and the decision is exactly the decision it's having to make in the new retail world across the UK. Oxford Street failings as an international centre. The fact that the existing store is failing both contributes to and is compounded by the fact that the west end of Oxford Street is also in decline. That decline is obvious and palpable. I said in opening, it's reappeared throughout the inquiry, go there, it has a smell. I didn't have in mind the smell of diesel, but rather the more intangible reek of failure, or second or third best, of cheap sweets, counterfeit goods. That decline needs to be reversed if this part of the capital is to continue serving its function as part of the International Town Centre. Such centres, and this is a development plan requirement, are required to be the focus for the majority of high-order comparison goods retailing. They're meant to secure opportunity for inter alia higher density employment in a high-quality environment. The Council describes the need for change at this part of the iconic shopping street as both urgent and compelling. The Secretary of State should heed this call for action. But so the position is more stark in retail terms, because without Marks and Spencer at this location, and they will, for the reasons set out above and not challenged by, say, leave if this application fails, without Marks and Spencer at this location, the decline of this area of the centre will accelerate yet more dramatically. So too, consequently, will its ability to act as a spatially important, sustainable location for growth. And there is on the evidence now no department store operation in the UK retail market. They've all gone, which would come close to being in a position to take the entire site vacated by M&S. What that means, therefore, is on their departure, the site will inevitably be split, and in the absence of quality occupiers that might be found for the remaining space, that's already apparent in the existing non-M&S retail representation in the vicinity, you would be left with an outcome of further decline. And that outcome is not consistent with the requirement that investment in Oxford Street should enhance the West End's position as a globally competitive retail destination. Suggestions from objectors and others to the effect that Marks and Spencer leaving would free up the location for smaller, edgier, shorter leases and food and beverage businesses are not supported either by policy or evidence, or indeed common sense. The nature of the occupation of this part of the street is already clear and deteriorating. The loss of Marks and Spencer's could only make this worse. The aims of the policy to use the street as the focus for high-order comparison retail, typically, you remember, flagship stores and associated higher-order offices, are wholly inconsistent with the inevitable and potentially terminal decline of the area if the last remaining national department store brand departed. And to this extent, the submissions of Selfridges and Primark and of the West End Traders Association should be given substantial weight. They share and express the very same fears of the local planning authority, of the spatial planning authority, and of M&S itself as to the very future of this street, once the iconic shopping street of the UK. The development plan in all of those circumstances calls for change, and it calls for positive, transformative, and urgent change. A failure to facilitate such a change will inevitably result in a land use planning reverse and not the positive transformation sought. In employment terms, the International Town Centre also sits in the CAS. Both of those are frontline strategic designations requiring them to deliver London's growth. In this part of the CAS, so important is the strategic employment function of the zone, the provision of offices is to be given even greater weight than even the meeting of London's pressing need for housing. Housing is for these reasons not an acceptable use of the application site. The development plan requires WCC to provide a minimum 445,000 square metres of employment land across Westminster. This site represents one of the best potential locations to assist in meeting that need. And the failure of the site to make any meaningful contribution to employment uses at all in the heart of the West End office market is at this accessible location a glaring one. Putting those two together, along with the transformative regeneration policy, We see that the city plan specifically targets Oxford Street as a location where much of its plan for growth can be met to significant effect. This must, we are told, include the transformation of Oxford Street to ensure a more diverse and interesting mix of uses and a better quality public realm that prioritises pedestrians, enhances shopper experience, and makes it a more attractive place to visit and to enjoy. Along with an improved public realm, the built form of Oxford Street offers scope, the plan says, for increased height to deliver a range of commercial floor space that complements the retail offer and provides modern workspace, reinforcing its role as a key commercial centre. And so the application site is one of a very few sites where such transformation, such scope for increased height would be achievable. It is by far the one which would benefit from transformative change most. Overall, then, sir, in summary, therefore, the existing buildings, agreed by all now to be failing to make an appropriate contribution in retail and town centre terms. There is no do-nothing option. They are inefficient and wasteful in terms of the uses which are on site. They make no meaningful contribution at all to the strategic functions of the CAS or the stated need overall to transform Oxford Street to a globally competitive retail mixed-use multifunctioning destination. These conclusions are not and are now not capable of being in realistic dispute. They are now agreed with SAVE and of course shared by the local and strategic authorities. Refurbishment. Marks and Spencer as serial refurbishers. Marks and Spencer is one of the country's most responsible businesses. It has a remarkable and recent track record of reusing and repurposing their own stores and other town centre buildings owned by their now defunct rivals. That remarkable and recent track record is second to none. And the scheme architect for many of these projects has produced evidence speaking to this experience for the purposes of this inquiry. And you remember the table in Appendix 1 of the statement, sir. Wherever and whenever Marks and Spencer can repurpose a building consistent with the needs of the location, they do so. Their record speaks for itself and is the best real-world evidence of their bona fides in this regard. They understand the potential benefits of refurbishment better than most, and probably better than any other high street occupier. But the benefits of refurbishment, as Mr. S accepted, cannot be the answer in all cases. First, and most obviously, as Mr. S fairly conceded, refurbishment as an option can only be a benefit if there's a realistic prospect of it becoming viable and deliverable. If there's no such prospect, then refurbishment does not and cannot offer any benefit. There is, in this case, on the evidence, no prospect of a viable and deliverable refurbishment of this location. It's common ground between the parties that overall retail floor space at the building, as well as being of poor quality, needs to be reduced in quantum. The site has too much retail space at it to operate efficiently in the present market, Mr. S agreed. In order for any development to succeed, therefore, there needs to be another use. No redevelopment or refurbishment would stand a chance of success simply by reducing the area of its existing land use, just a smaller shop. Second land use is thus necessary. Mr. S agreed this proposition also. In this case, the only meaningful appropriate choice for development is the priority use of this location, namely office. And on any meaningful refurbishment, such office use would need to occupy the upper floors of the existing building and would also need a ground floor presence or address on any meaningful refurbishment. The viable and deliverable delivery of this space over the upper stores of 3 buildings is critical to the delivery of any reasonable refurbishment option, Mr. S carefully agreed. And once this fundamental element of any refurbishment option is understood, then the criticality of the evidence as to the delivery of this part of any refurbishment tangram has to be agreed. And it was. It's a jigsaw tangram
Thank you. Save me looking up.
Yeah. It's a particular type of jigsaw where there are a series of pieces which are of critical importance. Once this fundamental element of any refurbishment option is understood, the criticality of evidence as to the delivery of this part of any refurbishment program has to be agreed, and it was. Mr. Sturgis agreed in terms that if this element of the proposal was undeliverable, then any reasonable refurbishment option was also undeliverable. And as the evidence below makes clear, it was always understood that for these and other reasons, the potential for refurbishment here was and would be undeliverable. For the purposes of the inquiry, that evidence on the state of the present market was again reconsidered, and the expert market-led evidence of Mr. McSee and Mrs. Kay was not challenged by Mr. S or SAVE. Indeed, it hadn't even been read by Mr. S. And nor in truth, sir, was it truly challengeable. Mr. McSee is probably involved in more West End office transactions than any other agent. Mrs. S is an immediate past president of the BCO and an expert on the internal and external requirements of the market in the West End. In the absence ever of any indication of what SAVE had meant by a deep refurbishment at any time over the several months that such an allegation was made, they were tasked with independently considering, and this is in their statement specifically, Mr. Sturgis wasn't aware of it, but that's because he hadn't read it. They were tasked independently to consider whether any reasonable refurbishment was deliverable at the location. They had the benefit of the structural potential for extensions provided by ARUP, and their conclusions are unambiguous and inexorable. They are based on in-depth assessment of a site and a threefold retail office methodology employed by themselves and by those actively in the market for office accommodation in the West End. They did not restrict themselves to a consideration of light refurbishment, as suggested by Mr. S in evidence, in rebuttal and in chief. And if he'd read it, then he would have been aware of this fact. So you'll appreciate that the main parts of their analysis are set out in the guidance, and we've gone to them. But for the assistance of the Secretary of State and for your summary of our case, I identify these particular elements. The issues with the site, they say, are so fundamental that any refurbishment of the existing buildings cannot address the main and inescapable structural issues with the building, which include but are not limited to its floor and ceiling height, dense column grid pattern, and its consequences in the disjointed nature of the three floor plates and resulting spaces. They also say that the rental levels would be so low as to mean that no reasonable developer would consider it viable to undertake such a refurbishment. They also say that considering the key criteria and recommendations coming out of the NLA panel on new work, New London Mayor's Plan 2024, it's their opinion that premises are not fit for purpose. There are low ceilings, there's a lack of natural light, small spaces to collaborate and gather, poor amenities, no connection to public ground, limited connection with nature and the outdoors, loss of identity and poor operational efficiency, all of which will mean that they will not be attractive tenants in today's changed world. In addition, they speak to the now accepted post-pandemic structural flight to quality. It's neatly put by Ms. S, who states that there's an increased focus on place and delivering user experience to earn the commute. Their evidence is then supported by real-world comparable evidence. Thus, as an example, evidence about the difficulties of Letteria Adelphi as a result of its restricted floor-to-ceiling height and column density. It was relevant in that case because those constraints over one large floor space were magnified in the circumstances of the present three multi-limb, multi-constraint, three-building agglomerations. We also pointed to the three other large department store refurbishments nearby, because correctly they say that they would represent the immediate and direct competition for the premises. Again, they explain neatly why refurbishment was only an option in appropriate circumstances and why it wasn't an option here. Thus, the evidence, which you'll have seen on the site visit, benefits from a large rectangular singular floor with no changes in level. Floor to ceiling height is good, and it benefits from good natural light on multiple sides. House of Fraser has a regular column grid, floor to ceiling height is 3.6, and a design density of 1.8. Building has none of the constraints that the Marble Arch site does. The M&S has none of the benefits of the House of Fraser block. And John Lewis block, which has a 4-metre slab dimension, very large floor space, floor plates, which M&S does not. Even here, an element redevelopment is necessary. They're all contained in the Appendix 5 evidence further. That appendix also makes it clear in viability terms that any likely, that should say, office values, achievable at this location, a compromised floor space, would not and could never come close to meeting the cost of provision. So the values are dwarfed by the costs and dwarfed by a very long way to provide a negative residual valuation of the premises, reinforcing their evidence that such floor space would simply not be deliverable. That's the appendix to this Goddard's rebuttal. Now, there was no challenge to any of this evidence, which was presented by Mr. Goddard himself, a valuation surveyor with copious experience of the London office and retail market, and who specifically agreed, adopted, and spoke to the evidence of the market reports. Then, both Mr. MacArthur and Ms. Salmon were shown Save's original objections and Rule 6 statements, and Ms. Salmon commented on them. I'm not surprised that despite many, many months of suggesting there is an alternative refurbishment option, not a single workable solution to the difficulties of these buildings has been forthcoming. It was prophetic in a way, but we know, not read by Mr. S, so couldn't have responded to it. But then he did, in his rebuttal, produce several sketches of an option which explained his position. We know that he did so without the benefit of any office or retail market assistance. He explained he hadn't designed for offices since somewhere back in 2005 or thereabouts. And we know now, without reading the fundamental issues raised by the experts about the potential for refurbishment, given the clearly identified and explained multiple inexplicable constraints for viable refurbishment contained in the evidence. That late sketch proposal, unorthodox in terms of its timing, underscored the complete unworkability of the refurbishment options. Thus, unsurprisingly, it didn't deal with any of the structural and multiple inescapable problems that had specifically been identified in the evidence which meant that the refurbishment was undeliverable and unfundable in the marketplace. Second, it proposed a servicing solution which was literally unusable. And third, proposed a solution for the colonnade which was unsafe because it would allow a 2.2 wide footway between the facade and the footway, considerably below the minimum required at this location by the TfL guidance on pedestrian comfort and safety. And finally, it failed to identify the location and disposition of any of the pillars and columns which had been identified over the many years as a central constraint. Now, Mr. McSee and Miss S were specifically asked to look at this late evidence. So when Malone and Friend says they were all speaking to something that wasn't Mr. Sturgis, wrong. They were specifically asked to look at this late evidence, and they confirmed through Mr. Goddard in chief that all of their main concerns remained unresolved. In addition, they explained the expense of removing the multiple cores added further cost, taking delivery yet further out of reach. And then finally, and without any advance notice, you remember Mr. S produced yet further evidence in chief, as to which you properly gave us leave for the applicant to respond. And notice in a footnote, Malone and Friend says our response was too long. We responded only to the 26 of the 37 new areas of evidence that were submitted. We went through the careful exercise of identifying which ones they were. And with the greatest respect to him, that was evidence which he gave me no notice of, which was put in on the morning and which we had to respond to. We don't complain about the nature of the response, but neither should he. Thus, that evidence was put in. The evidence, and you remember humorously, Mr. Sturgis said, no doubt I'll be told if I've got this wrong. Yes, you will, Mr. Sturgis. And he was wrong. The evidence was even more unorthodox, and he was even more wrong. But in hugely probative ways, and in ways which my learned friend just simply doesn't deal with in his closing because he can't. The document showed how fundamentally the constraints associated with the proposal had simply not been understood. At slide 25, you'll remember, Mr. Sturgis explained to you, sitting to my left, that the columns here were largely regular, and he sought for the first time to try and impose them on a diagram. And he said, I may have got it wrong, and no doubt I'll be told if I'm wrong, and I'm not saying everything is right. Unfortunately, he shows 88 columns in a place where there are in fact 114. Furthermore, he placed very many of them in the wrong position. See our rejoinder note, which is inquiry document 43 on that slide, slide 25. In his oral evidence, he now accepted that his original response to the service bay was undeliverable, as Mr. Pilbrow said it was. But to look very carefully through his slides, he produces no credible alternative in the new slides. Mr. Pilbrow's response note established this in-principle element of the operation is simply not resolved or not resolvable. You simply can't get a delivery vehicle into the space because the space is constrained by the existing unsuitable building application. Then, sir, I'm sorry, he made the mistake of relying on 101 Cavendish Street as an example of how refurbishment might work. He'd not relied on it before, and it is a bad example. I don't know whether you think you need to go and see it, but we'd be happy if you did. It's a wholly different building.
I think I have the evidence on it.
It's a wholly different building from a different period and with a very different structural floor space and column density. It's not comparable for the purposes for which Mr. S sought to provide it. If anything, its failure as a building, refurbished twice in very quick succession, long periods of void, still large areas of non-occupation, they're now in a large part of the site completely unoccupied, speaks to the absence of potential for the much more constrained Marks and Spencer site. Then, sir, you asked right at the end, one of your 4 questions, whether Mr. S thought that the West End market was a particular and special one, and he accepted that it was. And you then asked him whether he was able in those circumstances to identify premises which had the multiplicity of constraints which were displayed at Marble Arch, and which you read out to him in terms. You read the whole list. He was then unable to identify one comparable successful refurbishment, much less one in the West End, which shared all of those characteristics. After the close of evidence, I think it's caught up with you now.
Yes, I've read it.
A number of premises was identified by his behalf, on his behalf by SAVE. As to those, you'll have noticed none are in the West End. Most are in evidence already before the inquiry and have been dealt with by the various witnesses. And all are self-evidently very different and less constrained than M&S. None are spread over 3 buildings, for example. Then, both Mr. McSee and Miss S were asked again to look at the new element of the scheme. So
that's the Harris. I hate to interrupt.
Yes.
But just on this point, you say very different and less constrained than M&S, none spread over 3 buildings, for example.
Yes.
But are you saying that there's other stuff already in the evidence?
Yes, there is.
Right. Okay,
Yeah.
that's all I wanted to know.
So one of them is the Glasgow that we looked at. The other one is Michael Squire's evidence, Michael Squire's premises in Brixton.
Right.
I think of the 4 established, 3 were already in evidence and have been dealt with.
That's extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. I can. Thank you.
Thank you, please. And I'm now moving to the viability and deliverability evidence, because both Mr. McSee and Miss S were again asked to look at the new element of the scheme, the new parts that were presented for the first time in chief. And they provide a statement to the inquiry, which Mr. Fraser has simply looked past. I'm assuming he's seen it. He simply looked past it. He says that none of the experts had seen a comprehensive scheme of the type that Mr. S was suggesting. Wrong. Their statement on precisely Mr. S's scheme identifies clearly and persuasively why the new minted proposals presented stand no prospect of delivery in any West End market circumstance. They indicate that all of their previous concerns about any reasonable refurbishment are also applicable to the proposed scheme. And finally, sir, the last set of slides, the new consideration of and reliance upon the Nike store as a comparable for the first time in chief is also simply incorrect as a matter of fact. The dimensions spoken to at Nike don't exist in Marks and Spencer. They're more than a metre wrong. Please see the slide where we've annotated the photographs. He said I haven't got the annotations on here, but they're broadly the same. They're a metre difference. The proper measurements, which far exceed those which would apply to M&S, were measured and the correct measurements added to Mr. S's slide. Again, Mr. Fraser simply sidesteps the fact that the floor ceiling dimensions relied upon by Mr. S are plainly and very significantly incorrect. Overall, sir, I don't suppose there is an inquiry that has had the benefit of all of this evidence in the way that this inquiry has. This inquiry has had the benefit of a site visit by an architect inspector to all parts of the three buildings. It's heard from Mr. P, Mr. S, and Mr. G, and has had the benefit of an expert tribunal examining the various plans with an understanding of the building. There will never be or have been a more thorough examination of the difficulties presented by the existing building. And we say the inquiry is able and should report clearly and securely on that expert evidence, particularly in relation to the multiplicity of elements that simply can't be changed across the three units. And it should conclude that there is no reasonable prospect of a deliverable refurbishment option. And Mr. S has further helped that conclusion by the work that he's done, because he didn't come here to do his worst, he came here to do his best. And even focusing on his best and on the essentials of a refurbishment scheme, there are simple, understandable, obvious and structural, in both senses of the word, impediments to the delivery of a workable and deliverable refurbishment. Such self-evident constraints on the evidence are, even on Mr. Sturgis's accepted case, fatal to the potential for any reasonable refurbishment option being viably delivered. Nobody is going to finance the delivery of several main, deep, fundamentally constrained floors of office accommodation across the existing plates of the building as a base for two new floors of office. That's simply not going to happen. And once this element of the proposal is understood to be structurally undeliverable, as common ground would say, that there then is no refurbishment option. This is one of the key jigsaw pieces without which it doesn't work, which is why I've spent so long on it. This substantive assessment that has been undertaken at the inquiry clearly explains the conclusions reached by both authorities on the strong support for refurbishment, and also points out how artificial are the other procedural concerns of, say, that Malone Trend concentrated on in his closing. So that's the office position. Turning to the retail delivery, Marks and Spencer has explained why the existing store is failing in the rapidly altering dynamics of retail. The store is insufficient in quality and flexibility to be a destination of the type expected to get people off there pushing the button on the computer. There's no meaningful challenge to this expert judgment on the evidence. Marks and Spencer simply won't run, and nobody would expect it to run such a failing store. It's closed many that are failing because that's the rational and proper thing to do. I say in parenthesis, and importantly, they are, of course, opening many others too, where that is the rational thing to do. SAIG does not demur from the fact that Marks and Spencer are not obliged to be sentimental or to keep stores open when they're not performing. So when the multiple inescapable constraints of the three buildings they presently occupy are such that they are, with their massive experience of refurbishment, able to say they wouldn't occupy such a store even refurbished, then that again is an entirely rational position. Of course, if the office provision is not deliverable, then this element of the case is purely theoretical anyway, because there will be no new floor space, much less no new retail floor space. But in truth and for completeness, even if there were to be a viable office element, any refurbished retail element of the potential refurbishment would not provide anything truly meaningfully better than the store from which Marks and Spencer believes it is failing will not continue to occupy. The same problems and the same constraints are largely in play post any meaningful refurbishment as prior. The existing constraints are fundamentally inconsistent with the running of a flagship store here. And further, there's no rational solution to the inescapable physical constraints to any retail refurbishment. Thus, look for it as you will, there's still no solution to the literal inability to gain access to the service area. Mr. S introduced a hugely complex and new concept for transferring the load above the servicing bay and zones achieved. But unfortunately, it still doesn't allow the relevant service vehicle enough height to get into the bay. This is an inescapable constraint caused by the need to keep the existing floor to ceiling height of this part of the building. And again, that's dealt with in INQ 45, 45. Thank you. Should have put that in, my fault. And the colonnade. Well, we moved back and forth, literally hokey-cokey in terms of the colonnade, because it was moved out and was told it couldn't go there because TfL is concerned. It's now moved back in, and therefore we get back our inescapable and pleasant retail fixed point in. We get our inescapable and unpleasant colonnade, a retail fixed point in Orchard Street, safely to accommodate tens of thousands of additional footfalls associated with the Elizabeth line. So the original flagship store no longer serves that function, and the reasons it can't are all made out in the refurbished store. But in order to get a refurbished store, you have to spend potentially tens of millions of pounds in the theoretical refurbishment, which won't happen in any event because the offices are undeliverable. What Mr. Fraser says, in closing and in cross-examination, is that for a refurbishment, Marks and Spencer might have to accept a series of necessary compromises. Also, frankly, that's not true. If the refurbished store is unable to perform materially better than the existing store, which it doesn't, Marks and Spencer has already indicated it will rationally and sensibly close it. If it's not rationally and sensibly, it's not irrational to close the existing store, then it wouldn't be rational for the Marks and Spencers to deliver the refurbished store by parity of reasoning. If it's reasonable to close the existing store, the refurbishment doesn't change the position. It would be irrational for it to stay where it is. It would be rational for it to go, and there's nothing irrational about the decision to leave. In the circumstances, nor is it a threat, or even close to a threat, as it was portrayed by Mr. Fraser. It's no more than a business decision not to keep running a failing store. And there's no issue as to the reliability or accuracy of the Marks and Spencer position. You asked Mr. Forshaw bluntly whether he accepted the position, and he was clear and precise in his answer to you on this point. And it was that he didn't doubt the truth or the logic of the M&S intervention. I understand that they can't afford to be sentimental. Don't challenge the fact that they will leave, is what he said. So that's a fact which is important in land use planning terms for reasons that we've set out elsewhere and I'm going to come to later. Turning now to refurbishment and whether the existing buildings are suited to the requirements for the site. London Plan Policy D3 requires the optimisation of land applications such as the appeal site it says that higher density should generally be promoted in locations that are well served. Under, importantly, quality and character, as part of the optimization of the site, decision makers are told to take into account the principles of the circular economy. That is the policy requirement, to take into account the principles of the circular economy. At 3.313, we are told sensibly that the best use of land needs to be taken into consideration when deciding whether or not to retain existing buildings. In other words, the main thrust of the policy to deliver higher densities at the best locations is a relevant part of the decision as to whether to retain existing buildings. There will be occasions when retaining the building and its circular economy benefits will be inconsistent with the other requirements for the site. Therefore, the need for a balanced and iterative approach to the circular economy is inevitable if London is to meet its ambitious growth targets on brownfield land, the majority of which already has lower density buildings on it. It's for this reason that even in the case of the most recent guidance documents, they reflect the fact and the policy intent of ensuring that keeping existing buildings does not unduly harm the meeting of the wider requirements of the planning system for any site. That's reflected in a number of places across the development plan, we've looked at two already, and graphically in the decision tree in CD 630. This tree is not policy. Following it is not and cannot be mandatory. But the way it expresses itself is, as Mr. S agreed, reflective of the intentions of policy D3. It asks that regard is had to the benefits of retaining existing buildings, but not if the buildings are, quote, not suited to meeting the needs of the site. Given what the development plan says, the wording is well chosen to reflect the spatial strategy. Thus, not requirements of the site or things that the site needs, but requirements for the site. That is, the things the site is required to do. If the buildings are not suited to the things the site is required to do in development plan terms, then, consistent with the circular economy, the buildings should be redeveloped and the best use made of the materials released. In the present case, the requirements for the site reflect its location and public transport accessibility, its designation within the CARS, and its ability to effect the transformation of this now failing end of Oxford Street. It's a hugely important location, the spatial feature and continued operation and existence of Oxford Street in the wide West End of London. The question is, therefore, whether the buildings and the benefits of retaining them, let's not forget that, true, are suited to these requirements. It's to be remembered that it's common ground that the status quo of the site is not sustainable and that Parliament has already granted planning permission for their demolition. Come back to that. So, is the building or are the buildings suited to the requirements of the site? First, plainly and straightforwardly, if the refurbishment is not deliverable, then it won't meet any of the requirements of the site at all. And Mr. S agreed. The present absence of contribution will continue and get worse, terminally so, on the evidence. So if the refurbishment simply isn't deliverable, that's the end of the matter. The requirements clearly can't be met. Second, SAVE is clear that on its case, any refurbishment should and must include the retention of all of the buildings on the site. That, remember, is their clear case. The applicant, for the reasons set out above, is clear that such a refurbishment wouldn't be delivered. But what there is agreement on between this side of the room and that is that there is no potential for a sustainable refurbishment of just the Orchard House building or just a facade retention. There's full agreement as to that. All main parties now accept in terms that none of these potential refurbishments could be viable, deliverable, or sustainable in carbon terms. There is, even on SAVE's case, and for very good reason, not a sustainable, deliverable Orchard House only based refurbishment. That means that SAFE agrees that the buildings, let me start that again. That means that SAFE agrees that buildings that by any reasonable assessment are unarguably of significantly poor quality need to be retained as part of any refurbishment approach. Townscape, character, and heritage terms, put simply, these buildings are not suited to the requirements for the site. They, and you know the ones I'm speaking of, represent to a lesser or greater degree an abject failure of the architectural profession at this location. And to be frank, trying to suggest otherwise is frankly hopeless. Not only do they present inescapable functional viability and deliverability constraints to the proper use of the site, they are also uncontextual eyesores of the highest order, which are clearly, in their own right, not suited to the requirement of the site, however reasonably understood. Third, the retention of the existing buildings frustrates the way in which the site is capable of meeting the spatial strategy of the London Plan itself, the main tool in the planning armoury for reducing emissions associated with accommodating London's necessary growth. So if net zero is to be achieved consistent with accommodating growth, that's the policy of the government, reflected in the NPPF. We don't say no more growth. If net zero is to be achieved consistent with accommodating growth, then London, as the most sustainable node in the country, has also to grow. That growth of 70,000 people a year and its associated activities, including millions of square feet of employment growth, is to be accommodated in London, because if it were to be, that growth were to be met more diversely, it would inevitably have an incalculably higher consequence for emissions. So within London, which is required to accept that growth and associated activity, growth has to be directed to the most sustainable locations within the most sustainable city. That has to be done on a spatial and strategic level. It can't be done on a site-by-site level. That's not how it works. It has to be done on a spatial and strategic level, with decision makers making the best use of land at those locations. And Mr. S clearly agreed that if this strategic policy is not followed, then accepting growth on other, less well-located sites, even in the capital, is bound to have large and literally incalculable impacts on the production of more emissions. The imperative to make the best use of land reflects and is the land use planning embodiment of the best and biggest thing that planning can do to achieve net zero. And those locations best suited to reduce emissions from the consequences of accepting growth are identified through the Good Growth Agenda. And as a location, the application site is at the high point of the growth tree. It falls within almost all of the categories of all of the most sustainable developments. It's in the CAS, it's an international centre, it has a PTEL of 6B without Elizabeth Line, it's sitting above the new Elizabeth Line. There can so be few better located sites in the whole of London in which growth should be directed. And if and insofar as a decision in this case frustrates the delivery of growth to this location, and it does, then ironically, it harms the very benefit that it seeks to achieve. And that's especially so if the outturn of this process is the further decline and deterioration of Oxford Street, which all of the relevant retailers are telling the Secretary of State is the inevitable consequence of turning over the application. Indeed, rather than transforming the location and Oxford Street in line with policy, the legacy of the decision to refuse, if SAVE's case is upheld, would be an unsustainable set of buildings which are accepted by all to make an insufficient contribution, unsustainable patterns of development, and the absence in the street of one of its biggest remaining anchors. That's the substantive case. I'm now turning to, very briefly, the allegation that the GLA and WCC have chosen not to apply their own policy. So the redevelopment of the site for the purposes proposed has the strong support of the relevant democratically elected councils who have been considering the application on an ongoing basis since 2019. SAFE, through Mr. S, have driven to argue that the authorities have chosen to disregard their own policies in relation to sustainability matters and have supported the redevelopment options really without due care and attention. Mr. S repeated the claim when prompted by you that he accepted that on the evidence, the applicant had done all that was reasonably required of it, and it was the authorities should fail to remember the exchange. This is both an improper and an evidenced suggestion. It is also in the light of the evidence above on the substantive matters heard in the inquiry, an allegation of little relevance, especially since it was clear that Mr. S had not only not read the evidence in this case most directly relevant to his own case, but that he was unfamiliar with and had never seen the most basic of GLA WCC documents concerning the issues. I shall nonetheless deal with this as I did in evidence. Had been considered by the council, contrary to their own policy, that the councils had only in reality considered a light touch refurbishment option. So these allegations are wholly inaccurate. They also fall to be seen in the context of the examination of the deliverability of any reasonable refurbishment scheme set out above. And there are two fundamental errors underlying their assertions. First, on the facts, GLA is recognised as a leading authority in this field. It operates at a level significantly beyond central government and is the authority responsible for the largest area of brownfield land in the UK. It's clear from the reports that the GLA and Westminster were fully aware of the inescapable constraints to the refurbishment and the rationale for redevelopment. The points set out above related to column density, floor ceiling height, the interaction of these across the three separate floor spaces are not complex or difficult to understand. They do not need to be represented by reference to a specific number of schemes or options. You don't have to have Mr. Sturgis' rebuttal scheme or as in chief scheme before you're able to understand the insuperable constraints to delivery. All you need is a proportionate and understandable understanding of the extent of the constraints. And that's what the local authorities had. We didn't hear any of these quotes from a learned friend in closing, but you'll note that in CD2, this is stage 2, the applicant investigated both the site-wide refurbishment and Orchard House facade retention. However, due to economic, structural and sustainability issues, neither option was chosen. Structurally inadequate floor-to-ceiling heights and buildings' inability to safely support additional floors, in combination with qualitative difficulties, would prevent the delivery of an improved retail and leisure building. This constraint would pose a risk to the viability of such an approach and the future competitiveness of the retail establishment, given the changing dynamics of the sector. All of these matters were considered and were at large and were taken into account by the GLA and the local authority. It's factually incorrect, sir, to have asserted that the GLA and WCC only had a light touch refurbishment option before them. The reports committee explained very clearly that more than these options were considered. So too, on a full reading, does the design and access statement. Thus, at CD 107B, you note there are the 16 options there identified as having been considered. One of those options was very clearly a cut and carve option involving office extensions above office floor space. And my learned friend said, well, it's just the one at the bottom right. It's not, sir. The very image above the text, it's the one chosen that the text speaks to, is the cut and carve option. And however, learned friend wants to sell what he was told by his witness in relation to this, you heard from Mr. Philbrow that that was actively considered and the reason it was returned were not considered further were set out in the column below. So look at that page really carefully, please, sir. And it's to be remembered, in addition to that, and well before that, that there were upwards of 15 pre-application meetings which took place prior to application. And then, as we've seen from the documents, a continuous engagement with the authorities following application on these and other matters. There's no evidence to suggest that either WCC or the GLA engaged in these pre-application assessments in anything other than a professional and responsible manner, having regard to the content of the adopted and then emerging New London Plan. And by the time of the application was made, the New London Plan had been published, and the intent to publish plan, which in all respects was identical to the present plan, had been long used for development control purposes. So this inquiry in the Secretary of State should proceed on the basis that these pre-application exchanges took place properly in a way which is consistent with the advice of the NPPF. The evidence establishes that at all stages, the GLA and the council remain strongly supportive of the redevelopment option. The engagement and cross-checking on these issues, CE, WLC and energy issues, continued. There were scores of post-application queries, all of which are reflected on these privately soon to be familiar consultation sheets. In this case, the information on the sheets is also to be seen in the context of those pre-application exchanges which took place throughout 2019, 2020 and 2021. Sadly, when taking Mr. S to the circular economy report, you remember right at the end of the re-examination, Mr. Sturgis, the circular economy support submitted in response to specific requests from the GLA on an inter alia strategic approach, Learned Friend failed to take Mr. Sturgis to the very section which, in combination with all the other matters set out above, and with which the GLA familiar, was of most importance. The matters there set out in the report are by now familiar to all, and they are the constraints of the building. They are there set out in the report, and they are these: complex and confusing layout, 5 small retail floor spaces. Each building has its own structural grid, external elevation treatment, floor-to-floor heights below current standards, particularly compromised on the upper floors. Column, grid, dense, and columns from various sections of development sit immediately adjacent to each other. I'll give you the reference in the quote. The Stage 2 report considers all of the relevant evidence supplied. It's clear that the evidence as a whole, considered over by this stage 4 years, was sufficient to allow the GLA to find that the proposed development accorded with the development plan. Thus, regarding circular economy, it says this. This is stage 2. Additional information relating to the strategic approach, operational work, waste of building materials was requested. The information as requested has been provided. The application therefore accords with the London Plan Policy S17. Same on WLC template. The WLC template satisfactorily addresses London Plan Policy SI2F. Is acceptable. Then, sir, that's the position that they reached. There was then a stage 2 addendum report for 2 purposes. First, to consider the very claims that Mr. Sturgis is now making about inadequate policing of its own policies by the GLA, particularly in relation to the other potential refurbishments, the Sturgis type refurbishments. And B, to consider whether the adoption of guidance, which was not in play at the time of the application, should now alter the position taken at stage 2, namely that the application was fully in accordance with the relevant CE and WLC policies. That addendum was taken to the Mayor with the benefit of leading counsel's advice, as Mr. S accepted, obviously keeping a close eye on it. The conclusion, as we are all aware, was that the GLA confirmed following its years of consideration, the applicant had given sufficient consideration for retention of the building. So that's the first reason why there's nothing in this approach. The second reason is that Mr. S very clearly confuses policy with guidance in coming to his conclusion that the GLA and WCC chose not to follow its own policy. He states in terms on several occasions, for example, that the provisions of the suite of guidance notes are policy, which the GLA has deliberately ignored, particularly those relating to demolition. So what is of importance is whether the development plan requirements have in substance been met. And as the GLA states, there is no development policy requiring priority to be given to retention or any requirement to test a given set of alternatives to a particular standard or in a particular way or by completing an identified table. What we know is that Westminster City is considering the potential for such a policy, but no weight can be given to that, and in any event, any such policy is stated to be applicable only where appropriate. And it's that very appropriateness of the circumstances where priority might be given, which will be key to an understanding of how the policy, if adopted, might work. Now, sir, some things that I hope are common ground, and I really would urge you to take into account when you're looking at the guidance, which has been referred to by my learned friend extensively. It's common ground that guidance is not development plan policy. It's also common ground as a matter of law that guidance should not contain new land use policy. That's the place in the development plan. And if SPGs are drafted in a way which do in fact create what are new land use planning policies, which go beyond the development plan, then put simply, they should not be treated as such by the decision maker. Well, that would be an error of law. It should also be common ground that the guidance doesn't have the same status as policy. It should also be common ground that the guidance cannot prescribe or delimit the number of ways in which a development plan policy can be complied with as a matter of law. Well, that would again, in effect, be to elevate the guidance to the status of a development plan policy. Now, a good way of testing this, hugely relevant to circumstances of this case, is to understand that a development plan policy can clearly be capable of being complied with in a number of ways, absent the existence of guidance. For example, when the guidance doesn't exist. There may be many legitimate ways of finding accord with a development plan, and a guidance note cannot remove such routes and say it shall only be done in one way. It is not a policy, it is guidance. And in clearly and unambiguously elevating guidance notes which are aimed at guiding those who produce statements and what should be put in them to policy, SAVE is in error. Read the proof of Mr. Sturgis in particular, please. He clearly and ambiguously states that the requirements of the guidance represent up-to-date policy which must be followed and only must be followed. I've given you an example there. That is completely wrong. And realizing this, Mr. Fraser sought by some difficult intellectual gymnastics, both in cross-examination and in his closing, to finesse himself out of the error contained in the proofs, which namely confused guidance with policy. That's the error. And he did so, in effect, by elevating the guidance notes, there to assist those producing statements, to what he now says are essential and indeed the only way, the essential elements required to ensure policy compliance. If you don't do it this way, you're in breach of the policy, is what he says. Well, that is treating the guidance as the policy, and it is not the approach that Mr. Sturgis put forward, or close to it, and it's not, as a matter of fact or law, an appropriate approach. The policy requirements are in the plan. The guidance for those creating the statements is in the guidance and can't and shouldn't be elevated to policy. The GLA made this clear in their stage 2 reconsideration. Neither can the guidance identify the only, much less the required way by which the policy can be complied with. As the GLA themselves at stage 2 indicate, having regard to their own policies, and at this stage, the full suite of the adopted guidance, including every single quote that the learned friend has put before you, they conclude that the proposal is in full accord with the development plan policies. And insofar as the guidance is concerned, it is only guidance, they say in the particular circumstances of this case that all relevant further queries have been answered and understood, and that sufficient justification for demolition has been provided. So, sir, there is no good reason in this case, particularly following the further consideration of the evidence as to the delivery of SAVE's preferred alternative, to set aside that considered and reconsidered position of the leading authority in the UK on these matters. That underscores the strong preference for redevelopment expressed by both councils. B, the existing buildings are not protected from demolition. They make a limited contribution to the settings and significance of a number of designated heritage assets. So this section of the closing will be very brief because we've an expert tribunal well used to dealing with such matters, and because the contribution that the buildings make to settings is already properly reflected in the building status. The fact that as a matter of law, the buildings are not protected from demolition, and indeed have been granted planning permission for demolition by way of the General Development Order, is now accepted by all. As I said in opening, this is not a simple legal nicety. And my learned friend goes as far as to say it's not even a material consideration. It simply can't be right. Why not? Because it represents the government's policy position in relation to protecting buildings of this category. The government has actually granted a planning permission by order for the demolition of these buildings. It is as valid as a grant of planning permission by any local authority for demolition, and as such and alone, get the fourth line. As such and alone is a material consideration of weight, irrespective of the fallback position. In this case, an extant grant of planning permission from the local authority would clearly be a material consideration in its own right. The same applies here, because that is what it is. It's a grant of planning permission. SAVE understands the danger and weight to be given to this position, which is why it sought to invent a spurious potential for Westminster City Council to extend a conservation area to remove the right. There's no evidence of the intention of Westminster City Council to extend the conservation area, come back to that, but especially is there no intention for them to extend it for a purpose which would be spurious and which would, in our submission, be clearly unlawful. Now, of that demolition right, all parties now accept that such permission exists, and there's no evidence of it being removed. The Secretary of State should please be so advised. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the issue of demolition shouldn't be considered as part of this application. It clearly should, and has been. But planning permission, whether given by direct grant or general order, represents the planning system's view of where the public interest lies. And in this case, the government has said that it's not appropriate or in the public interest for developers to need to apply for planning permission, much less to pass the test of demolition of buildings such as this. Further, the fact that the application site doesn't lie within a conservation area is and can only be deliberate. As a matter of law, the site cannot be treated in any other way by the decision maker. It has not been thought important enough to qualify or pass the test required for inclusion. Local authorities are under a duty to consider and reconsider the boundaries of conservation areas. There's no suggestion that somehow WCC is in any sort of legal default of any such legal duty. And as Mr. Forshaw accepted, it could have, if it had thought the site merited inclusion in the conservation area, have added it as part of its consideration over any of the 4 years of this case. If it had thought, hang on a minute, this has fallen through the net, it would have been under a duty in the last 4 years to say, well, ooh, there's some demolition going on here. There's no suggestion that it's acted inappropriately, and it hasn't. It follows that the highest heritage value that can be ascribed to any part of the Orchard House building is that of non-designated heritage asset. So it shouldn't be treated as if it were a listed building. The purpose of the designation in the concept designated heritage asset is to engage a very different level of protection as a matter of policy and law. The staircase in the undesignated heritage asset appeared as a trump card played in Mr. Forshaw's rebuttal. It had always, in truth, been understood as being present and is referred to in the coil by Historic England in terms, and I'm about to say without great enthusiasm, because it's a commonplace in this architect's work. More importantly, as a true estimation of its worth, is that in each of Mr. S's refurbishment options, Butland-in-Chief, the SAVE scheme actually removes the staircase it says is so important. And it does so not just in something that is a by the way, it does so as part of the integral part of the opening up of the retail area and the removing of the cause, which is said to be the central part of Mr. S's promotion and proposal. What do I say? Well, Mr. Forshaw, I'd say, really should have disclosed this loss rather than hoping that nobody would discover it, but it chose not to. All the time it was trumpeting the merits of the staircase, it was also promoting a scheme which lost the staircase. Mr. F said that its significance could be saved in part by salvaging the material. Well, we agree that it could, but disagree that it's a truly significant feature. Clearly, it's not thought significant by SAVE to save in a building, even a building that's being refurbished by SAVE. Further, large parts of the site, as you can see, and other buildings clearly detract from the settings of the relevant designated assets, as a site visit undoubtedly made clear. Selfridges, the main but not only designated asset in play in the present case, is bold, confident, appropriately a little brash, as I said in opening, and monumental. It's a hugely significant presence and was for years before Orchard House was even built. What all that means is, in truth, very little of Selfridge's significance can ever derive from Orchard House and its environs. That judgment is, of course, consistent with the fact that the boundaries of the conservation area are drawn tightly around it, and don't include the application site. If Selfridge is the most significant asset in Skopje, truly relies upon the application site for a large proportion of its significance, it's a Foreshaw's assertion, then its exclusion from the site's exclusion from the conservation area would simply be inexplicable. And simply it's not. Its exclusion is entirely rational and consistent with the absence of listing. Overall, therefore, Orchard House is not protected from demolition at all. Indeed, it has planning permission to be demolished. Its exclusion from the conservation area and the refusal of an application to be listed are legal facts. The buildings are non-designated heritage assets, but the designated heritage assets do not really rely on them for their significance to any meaningful extent. See, the proposed redevelopment clearly meets the spatial requirements for this site and brings very significant public benefits. The spatial requirements for the site were carefully sketched out in opening because they are relevant to the issue of whether the existing collection of buildings can in truth be suited to meeting the planning and other good growth requirements for the site. I don't, you'll be pleased to hear, need to revisit these matters in closing, particularly since it's now accepted and reflected in the statement on the ground that the proposal does in fact very significantly meet the requirements of the site. With one or two small exceptions, all of the hugely powerful benefits contained in the report to committee, in the mayoral reports, are all accepted by SAVE as being deliverable in full by a viable scheme. See Mr. Forshaw yesterday. Capable of viable occupation by land uses that are consistent with the relevant designations, which make the site one of the most sustainable in the capital, and which are strategic in this scope and breadth. The proposals thus make best use of brownfield land in the town centre with the highest public level of transport accessibility. From the earliest pre-application meeting, the principle of redevelopment of the site to being a multi-use transformative presence to Oxford Street has been strongly supported. The proposals replace 3 interconnected 4 pieces of townscape, run as a whole, with a high quality sustainability of exemplary design quality. They replace existing execrable public realm and permeability with a new quality arcade through the site, restoring a traditional route, new pocket park, and safe footpaths along Oxford Street and Orchard Street, all consistent with the requirement for transformation. The proposals sustain and enhance the retail offer of the street in a significant way. Footfall will increase. There'll be an overall enhancement of the function as part of the frontage. Provision of Grade A offices, much needed, will be improved. Mr. Forshaw agrees with this proposition. Premises would be expected to let quickly and efficiently. The building will be one of sustainable buildings in the whole of the capital, achieving Graham outstanding. The wider economic benefits have not been the subject of dispute of the inquiry, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be the subject of report to the Secretary of State. And I'll just give you the headings here, sir. The Volterra report is contained and summarised in the evidence of Mr. Goddard. It carefully dissects the retail need case for proposals and the benefits which will flow from it. It confirms that in the absence of the proposals, the potential downward spiral is likely to have wider economic effects than simply on Oxford Street. That's paragraph 117. It assesses the need for commercial space in the West End from an economic perspective. It confirms that at this most well-located site, the proposal would actually represent 10% of Westminster City Council's entire office hall requirement for the planned period. Paragraph 118. All these benefits, or I should say, none of these benefits are challenged by SAVE, and indeed they are accepted. What is said, of course, is that they might potentially be achieved also by an alternative full refurbishment of all of the buildings. The reason set out above, there's no realistic prospect of such a refurbishment, or of a refurbishment being suited to meet the requirements for the site. Overall, this is a package of delivery of requirements placed on the site by the development plan, which is strategically important in terms of its delivery and strategically important for purposes of London. D, this proposal brings these huge benefits without unacceptable heritage harm and entirely consistent with government and development plan sustainability policies. The impact of a proposal upon heritage assets, as I said in opening, rarely assisted by lengthy submission. So I propose simply to consider SAVE's primary submission, namely that the proposals unacceptably harm the setting of Selfridges as a Grade 2 style building. The impact of the proposal on the relevant settings of the conservation area and other settings of listed assets has already been considered exhaustively in the evidence of Dr. Mealy. In short, and for the reasons relating to the quality of the proposal and the paucity of quality in many of the existing settings, Dr. Mealy, the GLA, and the City Council are of the view either that there is enhancement, or that there is no harm, or that any harm there is significantly outweighed by the benefit of the quality of the building itself. As to the quality of the building, sir, the analysis of the GLA and the WCC document speaks to its excellence and to the fact that it is of exemplary quality. Your treatise on beauty being in the eye of the beholder and the subjective element involved in assessing quality means that this time at least I shall refrain from poetic exposition. But the care and scholarship which have gone into this building will be apparent. The appreciation of context by the architect was clear, and the detailing and handling of the bulk, scale, mass and material are rightly lauded by the conservation officers of this authority. Returning to Selfridges, the first thing to note is that Selfridges, as mentioned above, is one of the most robust demonstrative buildings in the whole of London. It was designed for that purpose. This means that the vast majority of its significance is intrinsic to the building, in and of itself. It is, as the Secretary of State has recently put it in another case that we looked at yesterday, significance that is locked into the fabric of the building. None of this intrinsic significance is capable of being disturbed by the proposal itself. As mentioned above, Selfridges predates Orchard House. All of that intrinsic fabric, all of that fabric significance existed at the time of its construction, and by definition did not depend on Orchard House, which Proust dated it. It still doesn't depend on Orchard House. Any significance which Selfridges has does not depend either significantly or in large proportion, to use Mr. Griffiths' words, upon the presence of Orchard House. Further, the proposal sits in an international centre, but outside Stratford Place Conservation Area. Oxford Street at this location is properly characterised by strong buildings of scale and presence. The existing setting of Selfridges and the conservation area itself is thus already characterised by buildings which properly reflect the globally important nature of the centre. This is appropriate and not harmful. It's part of the existing character of the conservation area. Yet further, as we have seen throughout this inquiry, the policy requirement for Oxford Street is a transformational one. That policy specifically recognises the need for and the compatibility of transformation with the ability to preserve heritage assets. And then under this heading, perhaps the most relevant sentence in the entire plan, because it's in the London plan and it's speaking directly to Oxford. Thus, the distinct environment and heritage of the CAS should be sustained and enhanced through development decisions, such as the transformation of the Oxford Street district. That is a clear recognition that transformation is not only compatible with, but required for the sustaining of environmental and heritage character in this very location. And if there is to be transformation in Oxford Street, then this is the end of the street which needs transformation more than any other. More of the same is neither deliverable nor appropriate. And if there is a site on this part of Oxford Street which can deliver this transformation, then this is it. It's more of a passing note, as I mentioned in opening, that the owners and occupiers of Selfridges share our view that the proposed M&S enhances the significance of their listed building. This opinion, though inexpert, is nonetheless instructive, where a significant part of the case against the proposal is that it diminishes the presence of and competes with Selfridges. That's not what the people at Selfridges think. Clearly, in retail terms, the owners of Selfridges don't see this. Finally, as I mentioned in opening, and as brought to light by Dr. Mealy during the inquiry, a building's presence and prominence depends on so much more than just its size. Selfridges has a presence and prominence because of its form, because of its consistency, and because of its detail. In this context, the proposal provides a building which reflects the proper function of the site of this location with a single building purpose designed for its place. In doing so, it sweeps away the awful elements of the existing townscape which add nothing to the setting of Selfridges and positively harm the setting of the conservation area. The proposal building deliberately does not challenge the monumentality of Selfridges building, but rather presents a finer grained detailed gridded facade, which is complementary in materiality, but clearly subservient to the giant vertical order of Selfridges, and is broken down by its angled building, changes in grid height, which specifically respond to Selfridges' presence on the street front. It also opens up new sight lines of the Selfridges, enabling, and to use the terms of the guidance, better revealing the asset to members of the public. As you were aware, the applicant, the City of Westminster and the GLA identified no harm to the setting of Selfridges as a result of the proposal. Indeed, the WCC specifically assert that the proposal represents a tremendous improvement to the appearance of the site as a whole. Dr. Neely provides the evidence in support for that appellant, for the applicant, and that's not repeated here. But the aforementioned opening up of more and wider views of the building by the proposal's comfortable rake showcase the listed building in a new and exciting way, allowing its monumentality to be read, to be understood from the streetscape of the before. Like the ugly colonnade and all of the other unacceptable things that are removed. I mentioned that, not mentioned. So significant weight and importance should therefore be given to the enhancement of the setting. It is true that Historic England does find harm. But as I explained in opening, it hasn't objected or indicated that planning permission should simply not be granted here, having regard to other heritage or planning benefits. Mr. Forshaw says, well, hang on, they're only a consultee. Their absence of objection doesn't mean anything. They don't really object. Well, if only that were true. Historic England object to the grant of a planning permission where and when they believe that harm is unacceptable. It's not shy, as you'll be aware, of asking the Secretary of State to call in applications, either when it thinks necessary, It's not done anything of that nature here. Indeed, sir, as you'll be aware, it puts the level of harm to setting Selfridges and indeed conservation areas is on the lower end, less than substantial, applying the criteria explained to the inspector of the Holocaust inquiry. Save's contention that there is harm to Selfridges towards the middle to upper end of less than substantial harm is, I'm bound to say, with respect, in the context of this case, simply not sustainable. It's a judgmental bookmark which is not rational and doesn't respect recent Court or Secretary of State's decisions. This is particularly the case when the existing uninspiring and poor quality buildings on the site are said by Mr. Forshaw to make a neutral or minor harmful contribution to the setting. Either this indicates that Selfridges' setting is perhaps not so sensitive as is claimed, and or that there's an internally inconsistent set of judgments at play on behalf of Mr. Forshaw. We would point you, sir, to the Summerscale House case for a proper approach to setting impacts. It postdates Bramshill, which itself postdates Anglia Square, and I say is compelling in its clarity and its logic. The Secretary of State there agreed with the terms, in terms with the inspector's analysis, so we know that the Secretary of State also finds it compelling as well as clear. And it says this, that the range of finding of less than substantial harm is very wide indeed, from a harmful impact that is hardly material to something just below that high bar. In cases where the impact is on the setting of a designated heritage asset, it's only the significance that the asset derives from its setting that is and can be affected. All the significance embodied in the asset itself will remain intact. In such a case, unless the asset concerned derives a major proportion of its significance from its setting, then it's very difficult to see how an impact on setting can advance a long way along the scale to more substantial significance. That's the approach, sir, which the Secretary of State should adopt. In the present case, for the reasons set out above, the Selfridges building significance is very substantially locked into its fabric. Most of its significance is entirely independent of its setting. As I put it in opening, it's flown in from Chicago a contextuality is part of its intrinsic interest. Of course, any harm to the significance of a designated heritage asset would, if found, be given considerable weight and importance. Where harm lies on the scale is hugely relevant to the nature of the public benefits of sufficient to outweigh such harm. Of course, the demolition of the Orchard House building will involve the removal of its significance. But in the present case, the public benefits identified above and not repeated here are of strategic scale and importance, and they are felt as a critically important part of the capital's spatial makeup. The very future of this part of the international shopping centre in the CAS will be secured by the proposal. These benefits are set out above, and they aren't the subject of challenge. The only reason they aren't given full weight, I say, relies on the potential for a refurbishment option. But there's been no consideration of the 202 or 203 balances, which might be at play in this case, if refurbishment is not a deliverable option. What a strange omission, and what an important omission, given the nature of SAVE's raison d'etre. It's only the local authorities that have undertaken that balance, and they were correct in their conclusions that applying the fasciculus of policies in the national guidance, the public benefits associated with this proposal not only outweigh, but very significantly outweigh any conceivable harm to the heritage assets designated or non-designated. Their analysis remains wholly unsullied in that regard by the evidence of this inquiry. I then set out so very briefly the what's left of the sustainability details. I wasn't proposing to read it out, but I'm happy.
That's fine.
I think it's clear it deals with your concerns and is not inconsistent with the way my learned friend puts it. I think the key thing to bear in mind is that as a matter of principle, SAVE is not now saying, 233, that a light touch refurbishment is a meaningful approach to the site. We agree, but because there are those that did take that view, this assessment remains valid to a certain degree. But 237, because of sustainability and other grounds, SAVE now accept that leaving the building as they are to make them the subject of a light touch approach is not sustainable or viable. There is, before you know, no sustainable do nothing option. If the Secretary of State agrees with this consensus, then the debate which has been raging in the rooms outside of this inquiry for days is little more than academically interesting, and even then, for some others.
Thank you. I'll read that in my letter.
I'm grateful. Overall conclusion. So the options for the Secretary of State in this case are clear. The consequences for the future of Oxford Street are profound. The Secretary of State has before him a proposal which on all parties' cases will meet the functional need to regenerate and to transform this part of the street, which is in need of urgent and compelling intervention. It does so by removing an NDA, which has been found not to be listable, and which sits outside a conservation area. The benefits mentioned above overwhelm any harm as a result of the loss on any rational measure or on any setting impacts of this robust international high street. The benefits extend to a building of exemplary quality, of exemplary design. The potential for these benefits to arise from a refurbishment is, on the evidence, illusory. Marks and Spencer's is the high street's arch renovator and refurbisher. Its expertise in this respect is second to none. If there were a deliverable option here, it would have delivered it, but there's not. The structural, multiple and immovable constraints to deliverable refurbishment here are legion, understandable and irreducible. Mr. S's evidence has helped to establish this rather than the reverse. Suggestions of the GLA and WCC fail to follow their policy are based on a misunderstanding of policy on the one hand and a failure to follow the facts on the other. Their strong support for area development, which makes best use of the site, is correctly stated. That support, in this case, is well placed. That support emphasises the urgency of the need for change here. And it's that urgency, sir, that we would ask you, that urgency, and benefits that come from meeting the urgency, that we would ask you to place before the Secretary of State, along with your recommendation that planning permission should be granted. Those are our submissions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Are we all done? In which case, can I thank everyone for making sure that we stuck to the programme? That's very helpful. And may I wish you all a safe journey home and a good weekend. The inquiry is closed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.